Good evening. I would like to thank everybody, His Excellency, my colleagues, business professionals, bankers, regulators who joined us tonight. And welcome to our second lecture this year. Second lecture in the Rami Makhzoumi Corporate Governance Chair Lecture Series. Thanks to the Makhzoumi family, OSP was a pioneer in establishing the first of a kind, the Rami Makhzoumi Chair in Corporate Governance at the Olayan School of Business at the American University of Beirut, among the business schools, the region's business schools. The chair's vision is to elevate governance education, awareness, and practice in the region to international best practices. The chair is devoted to dissemination of governance, knowledge, and research by way of closely exposing leaders to solid evidence and tangible experiences of good and bad governance, and thus unveiling the motives of governance adoption among regional companies. The chair thus aims at putting the academic theory and findings of extensive research to their best use by being carried through to practical implementation and application of governance among companies in the region. We have a special guest tonight, but before I introduce our guest, our Dean Wilfred van Honecker, the Dean of the Olayan School of Business, would like to welcome everybody and basically update you about the latest and the greatest activities we have undertaken at the School of Business.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Asim, for the great introduction. It's very good to see all of you. The students I see every day, but it's great that we see more and more people of the business community and the external community, which is certainly an initiative that I want to build on together with my colleagues. As many of you know, I'm a relatively new dean, and when I arrived with my profile and background, there were very, very high expectations. And I'm happy to report that we are well on the way of positioning the Olayan Business School as a real global entity. And we are well on the way to do it in a very creative and innovative way. One of the fastest way to the top is to do things in a little bit of a different way. And I think we are in a part of the world with a faculty and an energy and a university that it is committed to do something really creative and innovative. We have started an initiative to really plug in and bring in world-class scholars to OSB. We have 2 this week, and I see Michael Brennan sitting in the back from UCLA there. He's sinking into his chair. Don't be ashamed, Michael. I mean, you're a real authority in finance, and it's a real pleasure to have him around. We also have Alan Cantro, who arrived yesterday, and I think he's suffering from jet lag, so I don't see him anywhere. But anyway, he was in the school around, so it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity, and I think it's fantastic for AUB and OSB to be able to bring world-class scholars in this part of the world. It will help us in terms of positioning ourselves as a real, leading entity, and an entity that can contribute in many different ways. Since I arrived, behind my back, they call me, Hurricane Wilfred, and some of you that know me a little bit might know why this comes. But we are about to start on some very interesting initiatives. One is around family business. As many of you know, this is the industrial basis of many of the economies, and also the Lebanese economy in this part of the world. And I think we can really do something world-class. And we have the ambition to become the knowledge center in the world in terms of family business. And I think we can do something really creative, innovative. We also are looking very carefully at turning OSB, AUB, and the community around AUB as real innovative, creative, and entrepreneurial hub of the Arab world. There is no way why we could not build a world-class institutional platform where the young energy, the ideas, the problems, technology come together, and we can really create sustainable, value propositions and new business models. So there's definitely a second strategic initiative that we're embarking on. And the third is called something, you know, sort of responsible leadership. Now that can mean many different things. It goes all the way from CSR, CER, of course the governance initiative and the support we get from the Makhzoumi family very much fits into that. But it also goes into philanthropy, sustainable heritage development, something that really is an area where we can build something unique as a business school, but also bring that to the world. And I think those are three very interesting initiatives. Since I arrived 4 months ago, almost 5 months ago, we are reviewing our programs, upgrading our programs. I have reached out to our alumni community around the world. Given the interest, I have been contacted by many leading business schools, ranging from Columbia to Stanford to Sloan, MIT, because they want to work with us. They finally have discovered that there's something in this part of the world that is positive, which is kind of shocking, but I think a fantastic opportunity for us to build on. My colleagues and many of my faculty are here. It's a real pleasure to see you. Have been very supportive in a lot of the things we have started. They're doing very well, a lot of young energy, but I think I'm really pleased and I'm very honored that actually one of our senior colleagues received the Eisenhower Fellowship and is going to, which is a very prestigious honor, and is going to spend the whole month in the US actually next month, so that's a real achievement. Our students are doing great as well. Some of you might know that the CFA Institute finances something that is called the Investment Olympics. And the OSB team won in Lebanon and is now going on the global platform, is going to go into London. Given the valuation report that they did for Aramex and the presentation that I've seen on YouTube so far, there's no question in my mind that they're going to kill all the competition in the world. So we're really ready for it, and I really congratulate the students and the energy and effort that they've put into that. All in all, very positive. There are challenges, but I think we're really pulling together. And I'm sure that, when you stay in touch, and we will make sure that you do stay in touch with OSB, you will see many of the interesting initiatives coming to bloom. And I really invite all of you to be part of this, all those initiatives, because it's always a team effort at the end of the day. As a dean, I don't do anything, I just watch. Okay, but thank you very much for all being here tonight, and we have a very interesting speaker, and I will let my distinguished colleague Hassam introduce the speaker for tonight. Thank you very much.
As my boss just said, we have a special guest tonight. His research interest spans from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. A leading scholar in developing the best interventions to cope with the aftermath of the financial crisis. Co-developed the Financial Trust Index, which is designed to monitor the level of trust that Americans have in their financial system. In addition to holding his position at Chicago booth, he's currently a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau for Economic Research, a research fellow for the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a fellow of the European Governance Institute. He's the president of the American Finance Association and editorialist for the Italian equivalent for the Financial Times. He also serves on the Committee on Capital Market Regulation, which has been examining the legislative, regulatory, and legal issues affecting how public companies function. His research has earned him the 2003 Bernasser Prize for the Best Young European Financial Economist, the 2002 NASDAQ Award for the Best Paper in Capital Market Formation, and a National Science Foundation grant in economics. His work has been published in top journals in finance and economics, like the Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, and the American Economic Review. His book, Saving Capitalism from Capitalists, co-authored with Raghu Rajan, has been acclaimed as one of the most powerful defenses of the free market ever written by Bruce Bartlett of the National Review Online. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times calls it an important book. His latest book, A Capitalism for the People, recapturing the lost genius of American prosperity, which is going to be the theme of the talk tonight. Born in Italy with high inflation and employment, which has inspired his professional interest in economics, has received a bachelor's degree in economics from Bocconi in Italy and a PhD in economics from MIT in 1992 when he joined the Chicago booth. On a personal note, I have met an impressive young assistant professor some 20 years ago. When I was a kid, I was a student, I was a PhD student at Boston College. When he gave a talk, and he was incredibly inspirational. He had passion in what he does. He wanted to make a difference. Please welcome the Robert McCormick Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, Dr. Luigi Zingales.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I apologize that I have a sore throat, so at some point I will drink some water to keep me going. I hope you understand. It's a pleasure to be invited here. This is my first time in Beirut, and I have to say that I grew up with images of Beirut on TV that were not exactly what I saw here outside, so it's really impressive to see how beautiful the city is and how prosperous the country is. And I've had the pleasure to chat with faculty here at the American University in Beirut, and I think this is a fantastically located position to become the center of research for the entire Middle East. As the dean was saying, is not an area where academic research in the United States is particularly interested in, but it is a very, very important area in the world, and so I think that AUB is phenomenally positioned for that. This said, let me try to first describe where I'm coming from, and then I will enter more in the specific of my book. You probably, most of you, associate Chicago, the Chicago tradition of economics, with Milton Friedman and George Stigler. And this tradition is focused mostly on two aspects. Number one, a faith that markets work better than governments, and two, a distrust for government intervention. In the word of George Stigler, the government intervention tends to be captured by the very same firm that should be regulated. So as a result, the intervention is designed to alleviate market distortions, tend to exacerbate them, and exacerbate them in the wrong direction, i.e. in favor of the very firms that have too much power. However, before sort of Friedman and Stigler, there was another Chicago tradition that goes back to Henry Simons, and in a little pamphlet written in 1934 called A Positive Program for Laissez-faire, Simon sort of take a slightly different view of the world. In the sense, first of all, he writes, of course, after a major financial and economic crisis, after the Great Depression, and he's concerned about the excessive power of monopoly and the fragility of the free market system. And what I try to do in my book is I try to merge these two traditions into a new Chicago tradition. So like Stigler and Milton Friedman, but unlike Henry Simons, I'm very much concerned about government intervention to be distortive, to be captured, to worsen the situation rather than improve it. However, like Henry Simons and unlike Stigler and Friedman, I am concerned about the excessive power that monopolies have, and in particular, I'm concerned about the institutional fragility that the free market system has. And so trying to merge these two traditions might seem to lead to an impasse, a cul-de-sac, because if you really think that the market is not perfect, but you are afraid of the government intervention, seems that you have no way to go. And in fact, I think that's not true, and that is sort of the second part of the book, is dedicated to try to give a positive agenda for, I would say, free market, not laissez-faire, but I would say a positive agenda for free market. So let me first start from the analysis part of the book, which is the first part. And in this part, I really warn Americans that their system, that they consider so unique and so different from everybody else, and I think that was unique and different from most other sort of system in the world, is degenerating into a chronic capitalist system, which is the standard, which is the norm in most other countries. And just to make sure that I'm not considered sort of somebody attacking the US system while defending his own country, I take as a negative benchmark my own country of origin, Italy. And I have to say that in this respect has been really very useful to provide negative examples. And, but I use that as a sort of rhetorical device to say, look, you don't realize that you laugh about some distortions, some excesses in Italy, but the United States is not that far behind. In fact, one of my favorite sentences, which has not made me very popular, neither in Italy nor in the United States, is to say that the US Congress is simply a vertically integrated version. Sorry, that Berlusconi is simply a vertically integrated version of the US Congress. Why? Because until now, Berlusconi used to own Congress. Literally, his employees were members of parliament, were responding to him, so de facto owned Congress, and owned the ministries that were his employees, and were actually writing laws to protect himself. US Congress is a bit more diffuse in the sense that congressmen today are not direct employees of any firm, nor are ministers or secretaries. However, they are forward employees. And the only redeeming feature is there are few firms that hire most members of Congress and most Treasury secretaries instead of it being one, and many is always better than one. However, the problem is similarly worrisome. And my major concern is that I see the success of the US capitalist that was fairly sort of untouched by corruption and regulation as a historical exception that is unfortunately destined to disappear, especially at times like this. If you look historically, populism is extremely strong in moments where you have an economic crisis, where you have a disenfranchised of middle class, and when you have a sense of detachment between ordinary people and small elite that run the country. And if you look at all these three elements, these three elements seems to be prevalent not only in Europe, but also in the United States in a major way. And so, why in the past things have gone well, and now why things are not going so well in the future? I think at the end of World War II, the United States found themselves in a pretty unique position. They were not only the only country that came untouched by the war, in fact, much more strengthened in its industrial power by the war, but also the country with, by and large, the best educated workforce. In 1948, 40% of US citizens had a high school degree, at the time where most countries had 40% of illiterate, and very few countries had more than 4 or 5% of the workforce with a high school degree. So at the end of World War II, the United States found themselves with, number one, a superior technology, a superior military power, a superior workforce, a fairly stable country, and nowhere else in the world where you could say the characteristics were the same. In a sense, in the 1950s, it was dangerous to invest in Italy or in France because they could fall prey of communism and be expropriated, let alone in other countries. So for US companies and for US technology, the only place where to invest safely was the United States. And as a result, the US high school graduate became a scarce factor. Now, you are in economics, so you know that a scarce factor earns a rent. And the rent that American workers had in that period is the rent that made possible the American dream, made possible the success of American democracy, made possible the fact that every generation felt that they would be richer and more prosperous. And in fact, for a couple of generations, this was the case. They were increasing at a dramatic rate their standard of living. They were able to send their kids to college. They were able to either personally or through their kids reach the American dream. And that clearly generated a vast consensus for the system. In addition to that, the system was perceived as reasonably fair. One thing that struck me as an Italian immigrating in the United States is how much Americans used to trust their system. Just to give you an example, I was in Boston, I think it was like 24 years ago, I would just arrived in the country, and I faced the first tornado watch. And for me it was a surprise because, first of all, tornadoes are extremely rare in Italy, and of course there are no warnings. So it was kind of strange for me. But what's even stranger is the fact that the mayor said, you have to go inside your house and tape all the windows and stay away from all the windows. And my instinctive reaction as an Italian, say, number one, if the mayor tells you to tape your windows, it must be that his brother is selling tape. And two, if they tell you to do something, you want to do exactly the opposite. Because the tradition is that if you follow the government, you get screwed. If you don't, or the authority in general, you get screwed. If you don't, you live happily ever after. And I'm sorry to report, but roughly a year ago, a big ship went down in the Mediterranean Sea. It was the Costa Concordia. And as the ship was taking on water in a major way, the captain said to the passengers, everything is fine, please go back to your cabins. Okay? So the Italians, who knew better, went on the deck with their life jackets and saved themselves. And the Americans, who believe in authority, went to their cabin and died. And I'm saying this because, unfortunately, this mistrust is historically well justified. It's not that we are evil and the Americans are good. It's simply that we got, in our tradition, a tradition of a government that authority in general that designed to screw people. And in the United States, the rhetoric of a government by the people, for the people, of the people, is actually not just a rhetoric. There was an element of truth. And so it was with a particular anxiety that I started to observe during the financial crisis that this image was dissipating. Not only I thought the worst of what was happening, I was given for granted that being Italian, I just imagined the worst. Even my American colleagues, even the most proper American colleagues, were starting to doubt that the system was fair and it wasn't rigged. So much so that I started with a colleague at Northwestern a survey, a quarterly survey about how the average American perceived the financial system and the government at least as far as the financial policy is concerned. And in December 2008, we asked whether the average American thought that Hank Paulson, in his decision, was acting in the interest of the country or in the interest of Goldman Sachs. And 20% of the people did not answer. Of the ones who answered, 50% said in the interest of Goldman Sachs. And whether this is true or not is to some level besides the point. Because in politics, perceptions are as important, I would actually say more important than reality. And of course, crazy perception will not last forever, but if there is this perception, I think is an extremely negative sign. And what is even worse is the fact that 6 months later, we try a similar survey. There was the Obama administration. The only difference is that Americans were divided whether the Obama administration was acting in the interest of the union or in the interest of the financial industry. Still, the majority of people did not think was acting in the interest of the American people at large. And I think that this is very sad and very problematic. Because it's hard enough to lose, and we are in a moment where sort of while in the United States GDP has gone up, etc., the average American, the median American, is not better off than 25 years ago. In fact, the median American male makes less when enters the workforce, of course in real terms, than his father did. Women are doing better because, of course, of the gender catch-up. But for males, the median males is doing worse. And so it's bad to lose in a game. It's unacceptable to lose when you think this game is rigged. I will always tell a story. Now he's in the audience, so I have to be careful to report it correctly. But I'll tell a story when my kids were small. And they were like 4 and 6, they were trying to play Monopoly together. And my son, who is 2 years older, was organizing everything. And they were playing for like 15 minutes. And then my daughter will leave screaming. And I would try to intervene, trying to sedate the fight. And according to my daughter, he was cheating. And according to my son, he was following all the rules. Now, being at the time the only one who knew how to read, he was selectively remembering the rules that one is in favor. And that's exactly, I think, the image of most Americans today. They don't understand the details. My daughter at the time could not tell for sure that my son was cheating or selectively remembering rules, but she was smart enough to figure out that there was something wrong. And her way to react was to scream and leave. And in a sense, is the reaction that we see spreading out in America and spreading out in Europe and throughout the world. Paradoxically, I'm telling you that there is a common thread between the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement. In a traditional ideological sense, they are the opposite end of the political spectrum. But they both have this sort of sense of unfairness and desire of revolt against overly concentrated power. Now, the Tea Party movement is fighting against a too powerful government that is interfering into private life. The Occupy Wall Street movement is sort of fighting against too powerful business, which is monopolistic and which interfere too much in our life. They don't understand that these two monsters are two faces of the same Leviathan. The problem is not government, the problem is not business, the problem is the marriage between business and government when government is able to shape business at its own sort of, for its own goals. I have sort of an image I always sort of remember. When the first time I went to the Grand Canyon, there was a big note saying, please don't feed the wild animals. And being the United States, they actually explain to you why there is a rule, which is not common in Italy. And they say, because if you feed the animals, they will lose their ability to sort of catch food in the wilderness. And so that eventually will destroy their ability to survive in the natural world. So it is in the interest of the animals that we put that note. Now, clearly, if the animals could choose, they would not put that note. It's much easier to get food from tourists than to catch it in the wilderness. I would like to have a similar note in every major capital saying, please don't feed business. Because businessmen love to be fed by government subsidy. It's much easier to make money lobbying in Washington, in Rome, in Beirut for some special privilege, some monopoly power, some protection, than to make money in the marketplace. However, the distortion in this system are leading businesses to be less able to compete in the global marketplace, less resilient. So it is for the good of business we have to limit the power of business. And this is one of the main and most important points I want you to get out of my book. I want you to bring outside of the world. that there is a big difference between a pro-market agenda and a pro-business agenda. Very often in the political debate, these two terms are used interchangeably. And it's true, a lot of cases, they are the same. But remember, the typical businessman or businesswoman, they want a free market when they enter into the new industry. The moment they are in, they want to increase barrier to entry to make profits. So while in the first step, they are completely aligned with the pro-market agenda, in the second, they're not. And I have nothing against business who create barriers to entry through better technological innovation, reputation for better products, and so on and so forth. That is the healthy way to compete. I have big problems when this way is achieved by lobbying in Washington. And lobbying has become the most profitable activity, not only I think the most profitable legal activities, I think also the most profitable illegal activities in the United States. And let me give you an example, and I have plenty of that, but I don't want to keep you here until midnight. So one story, you probably have heard of Tyco, a US company that became famous for some corporate governance scandals at the beginning of the 2000s. Besides the corporate governance scandals, Tyco did a reverse merger with a Bermuda company to elude US corporate taxes. So at some point, a US senator, a Republican, so we're not talking about a radical extremist, a Republican, decided that it was a good idea to make sure that companies that were trying to do this reverse merger to elude taxes be subject to the same amount of taxation. Now, this small change in the law would have cost Tyco $2 billion. Okay? Which, if you flip the end of it, is saying that they were eluding taxes for $2 billion and their action was costing the taxpayers $2 billion. When this sort of norm was proposed, the CEO of Tyco called Jack Abramoff. Now we know the story because Jack Abramoff eventually did something illegal and went to jail. But everything I'm describing now is perfectly legal, and we know it only because he went out of business due to his illegal activities, and so the only thing he had left is to tell a story. And so that's the story he tells. So the CEO of Tyco calls him up and say, this is an emergency, I want your A-level team. Say, no problem. With a modest price of $150,000 a month, I deploy the A-level team in order to make sure that this will never happen. And the A-level team will play the typical sort of strategy of the bad cop, good cop. So the good cop team will start donating to the re-election campaign funds of all the senators involved, including the one who were proposing that norm. That was a way to mollify the opposition. And then the bad cop team was creating fake grassroots organizations. Now, listen again, fake grassroots organization. There is even a term for it. It's called astroturfing. Because you create sort of organizations that appear as spontaneous, and they say that capitalism as we know will end if we tax Tyco. And sure enough, with the modest price of $4 million, Tyco got what it wanted. So it saved $2 billion. So I know this is a successful case, but most of these cases are successful, even controlling for the probability. The return on investment of $4 million that gives you $2 billion. I'm not an expert in cocaine, but I don't think even dealing in cocaine, you get this kind of returns. So it's not a surprise that Washington, D.C. has become basically the wealthiest place in America. A lot of people older than me were saying, if you were to go to Washington in 1975, it was hard to get a good restaurant because it was kind of a southern city where not much was happening. Today is more exciting than New York, and 7 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States are in the suburb of Washington, D.C. Now, nothing good is produced in Washington, D.C. So the only reason why they're so wealthy is because of lobbying. So this is really a problem. And I have to say that as a libertarian, traditionally, I have always been sort of at least positively disposed toward lobbying, because lobbying is part of freedom, is actually protected in the American Constitution, is the ability to fight against an unjust government. And I think that as long as it is that way, it's fine. The problem is that we used to have a lobbying that was fight to get the government off your back. Now the lobbying has transformed itself into lobbying to get the government in your pocket. And that is a dramatic shift that all of us who are concerned about free markets have to take notice and have to think about what we can do. And the damage is not only the distortion, because clearly you don't invest in R&D when you have those returns in lobbying. You invest in lobbying. So that detracts from the competitiveness of the US economy. But in addition to that, it does create a sense of mistrust, which is becoming more and more pervasive in the American population and leads to a revolt, leads to sort of some kind of disaffection. And I have to say that unfortunately, these problems are pervasive, and they are made worse by the public finance situation of most of the Western world. Most of the Western world used to resolve this tension by giving away money and benefits to people. And because giving away stuff cost, the way they were paying is through IOU, future sort of debt. And this cost was not that dramatic. Why? Because if you have a large population growth and you have a large economic growth, the burden that you impose on future generation for the debt you contract today is minimum. Because $100 of debt today to a generation that is twice as big and twice as rich is only a fourth of the burden. And so this is the closest thing to a free lunch that we have in economics, shifting the burden as population and the economy grows. Unfortunately, those two things not only are not working anymore, they are working in some countries in the reverse. It says now population is not growing, especially in Southern Europe and in Germany and in Japan. So not only you cannot play the game, you have to start paying, because if you don't want the burden to increase exponentially, you have to start paying down. And economic growth in the Western world has been relatively limited, which is not a drama in a sense. I think is fantastic that China and India are growing at 6 to 10% a year, because they need to catch up at the living standard of the West. And if the West grows at 2% per year and the rest grows at 7 or 8, is only, I think, fair at some level. The problem is that the decrease of GDP growth at the same time with the decrease in population growth makes it more difficult to pay off the consensus of people, giving them some free benefits. And that's a reason why the consensus for the traditional parties is breaking down. I don't know whether you noticed, but the last election in Greece, 45% of the people voted for either two extremist communist party or for a Nazi party. That's pretty scary. In the last election in Italy, 25% of the vote went to a professional comedian. And I emphasize professional because some of our previous leaders were sort of amatorial comedian. He's a professional. So a professional comedian who sort of, without any clear idea, he got 25% of the vote. And another 29 went to a Eurosceptic party led by Berlusconi. So this is coming, and I think Spain will be next, Portugal will be next, and even in Germany, we see that now there is alternative Germany where they want to get out of the euro, they want to fight the traditional party. The social consensus is breaking down. And so my line is populism is inevitable. There is no escape given the economic and political situation. And the question is what we do with it. One possibility is saying we should fight it, we should blame it, we should sort of repress it, we should do everything against it. And here I take a challenge and I say, can we channel some of those demands that are rising by these populist movements to improve the system we live rather than to destroy it. And I know that in Europe, and Lebanon is part of the extended Europe, in Europe, the word populist is a four-letter word. I don't think we have any tradition of quote-unquote good populism. In the United States, however, there is a tradition of good populism as well. This is, the United States had their fair share of crazy populists, so it's not that we have the monopoly. But at the end of the 19th century, in economic situations that were extremely similar to the current one, there was a party called People's Party that ran the platform that was to rebalance the power between large business and small individuals. And many of the solutions they adopted, I don't agree with. However, the spirit that led to that movement was a good spirit. And the interesting thing is that while the People's Party never won an election, its ideas trickled down and were eventually received by, listen to this, a Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, that initiated a period called Progressive Era legislation that brought to us many of those broad rules that make capitalism better. So the antitrust law was invented during this period and was enforced during this period. The thing that I always remind my Italian friends is that in 1908, the US judges were able to take on the richest man in America, Rockefeller, who, by the way, was the founder of the University of Chicago. But they were able to take on Rockefeller. And they won. Now, in how many countries you have an example in which the richest man in that country has been taken off not for political fight, in a sense, Putin does that all the time, but it's simply because he's trying to undermine a political competitor, but it's taken on because violates a principle that is written in the law and win in a positive way. That is the kind of channeling of forces that I envision. Now, the question is how to do it. And the first step is clearly to make this distinction between pro-market and pro-business very clear. Until people mix the two, there cannot be sort of a clear reform agenda based on that. And I think I take responsibility as sort of a free marketeer, professor of business in a business school. We have been too lenient in condemning, criticizing the things that business does wrong. I think we should be the first one to do it. Why? Because that really undermines and destroys the image of capitalism in this country and throughout the world. The reason why capitalism is still a bad word throughout many countries in the world is because they remember what some monopolistic companies did in the past. Go to India and the scars of the East India Company are still very alive there. And some people claim also the spread of corruption goes back to that period. So we need to be the first one to fight against that in the name of a fair, competitive way to do business. But this is not enough. There is a tension, as I was telling you at the beginning, between a view that any form of regulation is corrupt and the form that sort of the market is not perfect, you might have excessive concentration, and how do you get out from this sort of impasse? And my solution is very simple. First of all, you emphasize the role played by antitrust, that is not just an economic antitrust, but also a political antitrust. Let me make an example. In the United States, for historical reasons, in the 70s and early 80s, banks were extremely fragmented. The regulation was crazy from any economic point of view. No economist worth this name could defend it. However, paradoxically, there was a silver lining. The silver lining was that the fragmentation of the banking industry made the financial industry less powerful in Washington. The moment they consolidated, they became tremendously more powerful. And so what I would like to have is that when you see a merger between two companies and the antitrust analyze sort of the cost and benefits of this merger, generally the analysis is done based on how big are the economies of scale, so what are the efficiency improvements, and how big are the monopoly gain, the market power, and whether the fraction of the first, the fraction of the efficiency improvements translated to the customers is big enough to offset the cost of this bigger monopoly power. And I say this analysis is all fair, but you have to add another element, that the excessive concentration of an industry has negative effect at the political level. If you are the largest bank in a country, you have a disproportionate amount of power to dictate the economic policy of that country. And that is not good for the country and is not good for the firm itself long term. Because if you get used to have it your way in your own country, you lose the ability to compete in the global marketplace. And long term, you're worse off. So the first thing we need to do is have this new way to look at antitrust. The second way is to try to really leverage the power of democracy by designing institutions that mitigate the excessive power of business. In the traditional Chicago view, the reason why all regulation was in the interest of the regulated entities was that the vast majority of people had no interest in getting informed. In fact, the economic view of voting is as extreme as saying it's irrational to vote. Why it's irrational to vote? Because the benefit of voting is how much you attribute to a different economic policy times the probability that your vote is going to change that policy. Now, even the most contested election in recent history, the 2000 presidential election in the United States, even that election was not won by one vote. So you can only change the vote. You're not going to change. So the probability of you changing the outcome is zero. Multiply by whatever number gives you zero. Just the cost of getting up in the morning and walking to the electoral booth exceeds that benefit. End of the story. And if you take this extremist view, there is no hope. I take a slightly different view. I think that all this analysis is fair. However, people are not only motivated by their monetary benefits. Now, there are very few heroes that do that for the interest of the country. But most of us are willing to make a small effort to improve the situation. Not a huge effort, but a small effort, because we care. It's sort of in economics terms, it enters directly our utility function. So the secret is how to leverage that small level of participation into the best possible outcomes. Because today, the system of regulation and democracy is designed to do exactly the opposite. To make impossible for normal human beings to have an impact because the burden, the barriers are too big. In the old days in Italy, the law was written in Latin. And in part was an historical consideration. In part is only the lawyers understood it, so they could make up whatever they wanted. And what they wanted was generally to protect the interest of who were able to pay them well, which are the rich people. So the law was in the interest of rich people at large and not in the interest of population at large. Fortunately, has been translated into the vulgar language. Now, if you read regulation in the United States, it's written in English, but it's ununderstandable. It's so long that nobody reads it. You know, people sort of joke when or laugh when I say that I want regulation that is so simple that even congressmen can understand it. They think it's a joke. It's not. Because when Nancy Pelosi passed the healthcare reform, she said, we need to pass it to figure out what is in it. Okay, so they recognize that they don't do. And why? Because the average congressman in the United States does 400 fundraiser a year, more than one a day. Okay? So if you do 500 fundraiser a year, you don't have time to read the laws. And so you rely entirely on your underlings that in general, they really work for you because they want to work for a lobbyist 2 years from now. And so their quality is determined, or their future job performance will be determined how clever they are in sneaking in complicated sentences, some loopholes that can help the businesses that pay them now or pay them in the future. And I found on the internet, this is a great thing about the internet, a former regulator that admit that. They said, we wrote regulation in a sufficiently clouded way to make sure there were loopholes to allow us to do whatever we wanted. Okay? That's the reality. So that's the reason why I want regulation, not only very simple, but the best form of regulation, in my view, is a form of direct taxation. Almost every form of regulation can be expressed through a direct tax. And the reason why I like the tax, I generally don't like taxes, but the reason why I like this kind of taxes is because they're very transparent. Everybody can understand what's going on. And by the way, as a collateral benefit, they might raise some revenues. So let me make an example that is from a few days ago. Mayor Bloomberg wanted to start a campaign against soda pops in New York. And his basis is that research is now proving that sugar is really one of the first causes of juvenile diabetes. And so because the juvenile diabetes costs us a fortune in terms of Medicare and so on and so forth, we need to sort of trying to limit. And of course, the kids that are drinking 20 bottles of Coke a day do not internalize the cost they impose to society about their behavior, because when they're sick, somebody would pay for them. Now, if you believe this link, now I'm not a medical expert, so I think it's true, but I don't want to enter into this discussion because it's not my forte. But if you believe this link, there are two approaches to do it. One is my approach to say, if that's a problem, you decide to impose a tax on the sugar content of soda pops. It's very transparent, and people can vote on the tax or can indirectly give an opinion to their congressman about the level of taxation. Is 5 cents a bottle too big or too low? Most people will have a sense, and whether they don't want it, in America, they don't want to pay a tax on gasoline. Seems to me crazy, but this is what democracy is about. At least, but if that's the case, at least let's not waste time with regulation that enriches only the lobbyists and the lawyers that design it. Because what Mayor Bloomberg is trying to do is trying to limit the size of the bottles or limit the number of distributors of soda pops in near a school. And then there is how many yards there should be between a school and the soda pop distributors. And look, I'm not following the details. No human being who is not paid, full paid lobbyist follow all the details. But I can tell you for sure that out of that table that is deciding regulation, one thing will emerge very clearly. The soda pop industry will make sure to impose barriers to entry to the newcomers. That's the way in which you get everybody to agree at a table. You screw people who are not sitting at the table. That's the best way to reach an agreement fast. And who is the constituency who is not represented at the table are the small producers, and especially the future producer, the producer that still have to be born, but they are the ones that innovate, bring new product to market, and make the capitalism vibrant. That's exactly what we need to prevent. And my system is saying, either you tax it because there is a consensus, or you forget and you move on, is extremely transparent. The tax will apply to everybody in the same way, and collateral benefits will also raise revenue, which is not bad. The last thing is I want really to lever the interest that people have in news to produce a better accountability of politicians, regulators, and authorities. How do you do that? Most people read newspapers for interest. And it says, in some cases you want to know because you have a business interest in that, but most people like to be informed. And journalists and academics at some level spend a lot of time trying to sort of distill and aggregate this information so that is correct, number one, and number two, digestible by the people at large. And generally, this process takes multiple steps. The academics do the fundamental research, and then the journalists translate the fundamental research into something that normal human beings can read, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that when you expose these things very clearly, there is no lobby that can resist. And my example is very simple. There is no lobby that is stronger than the tobacco industry, or was stronger than the tobacco industry. Okay? Academic research explained to people in 20 years made sort of smoking from a normal habit to, at least in the United States, I know that Italy and Lebanon are different, but at least in the United States, an anomaly. Today, I remember a day in which I was driving my son to a party. It was like 7 or 8, and I had a cigar in my mouth. I don't smoke, but I had the cigar. I was chewing that cigar, and he said, "Daddy, can you please take away that cigar from my mouth? I don't want my kids to think that you're smoking." Okay, so it's seen as a social stigma in the United States that you smoke. Now, I don't know whether it's right or not wrong, but what I'm saying is it is possible to make this transformation. In order for this transformation to take place, what we need to have are two things. Number one, a better access to data. Why? Because the data, Francis Bacon was saying, knowledge is power. I say data is power. Data is what you need to make somebody accountable. When you have a piece of regulation, when you have a regulator, the state a claim, we're going to do this in order to improve that. Okay, give me a measure of that, and 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, I want to see whether you achieve that. Because, you know, we have a lot of good intentions that go completely the wrong way. We want a way to monitor that. But regulators are extremely reluctant in sharing data. I learned my own way when I was a young assistant professor. At the time, Hassan remembers me. I was trying to get some data from the Bank of Italy to study the most obvious thing, whether sort of businessmen were sitting in boards of banks were receiving sweet loans by the bank. That's pretty important, and if you are a central bank, you should be extremely interested in the outcome of this research because it's a form of financial stability, blah, blah, blah. I was never given the power to do that research because the Bank of Italy has this data that are confidential, and you can access to them through an employee of theirs if the research is approved, but you cannot access if the research is not approved. And by chance, they choose not to approve that research. However, unfortunately, it's not just Italy, because a colleague of mine did a research on state regulators in the United States. State regulators issue some ratings of banks. And for sort of stability reasons, those ratings are not made available immediately. However, they could be made available with a delay. This is, we don't want to know whether today Citigroup is in trouble because this created bank panic, but 3 years from now, it would be interesting to know whether the regulator thought the Citigroup was good or not. Now, this data is not publicly available. It is available through the Fed. This colleague did a study. They didn't like the result of the study, and they said, first of all, they tried to even stop his study. They couldn't, but now they're not going to give access to this data to anybody in the future. Why? They don't want people to be accountable. And so my view is the combination of data availability and competition in the media and academic sector brings information to light and can change capitalism for the better. So we need to have sort of the two together. And as an example of this working, many people say, you know, your set of recipe is requiring turkeys for vote for Thanksgiving or Christmas, depending on your tradition. And they will never do that. And I said, you're wrong. Because if turkeys can be killed before, they're very delighted to pass a norm that we have to wait until Christmas. And the example of this is when there was a practice in the US Congress to basically do insider trading. If you are aware, a head of a health commission, and you learn about a change in regulation ahead of time, you could buy or sell companies that you know would be affected, make money, and this was not illegal. Why? Because, surprise, Congress does not apply laws to themselves. Now, some congressmen who are better than others try many times to make a proposal, and they were able to reach 3 or 4 signatures. It was going nowhere. Then a book came out. A book came out documenting all the trades of all the congressmen, and the only thing that was sort of stunning is how bipartisan that was. There was no difference between Republicans and Democrats. Everybody was trading the same way. Now, that book appeared. 60 Minutes did a report doing a double check on the results. Within a week, Congress and Senate passed a law and the president signed it. So it is possible to change when you put enough political pressure, and the way to put political pressure is to make this information available. Now, the reason why that academic or journalist was able to write the book is because the data were disclosed. Without that disclosure, you could not have that result. So the combination of disclosure and, listen to these profit motives. It says the guy who wrote the book didn't write the book because he wanted to make the world a better place. At least I don't think so. He wrote it because he wanted to make money. But that's exactly what capitalism is about. That's exactly what Adam Smith said. It's great. In a good system, profit motives lead to the best possible outcome. And that's true also in this arena if we have data available to everybody. The selective use of data, the selective access to data is worse than no access, because the selective access gives access only to the one who reach, quote unquote, the right conclusion. And you know, even among academics, it's not that most people demand you to reach the right conclusion, but they kind of know where you're going with your research. And if you look to sort of a socialist or too revolutionary, you are not going to have access to that data. If you look like you're going to reach a good outcome, you're going to have access to that data. So this is really an important consideration. And let me conclude, because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. There is another aspect which is often forgotten, and I think I should take it as a goal, and we as professor and community at the business school, we should take it as a goal. Traditionally, economists have been quite skeptical about social norms. They write complicated models about law and economics, about how sort of different norms can affect incentives, but they are not particularly eager to talk about norms or to talk about ethics or moral, etc. And you know, I'm not a moral philosopher. I feel I have no authority and no knowledge to talk about moral with a big M, capital M. However, I'm an economist, and I know that certain behaviors are really negative for the market overall, and certain are not. And so the question is, when I teach, should make it clear that is not a good thing to do those behaviors? Or should I be agnostic? Or worse, I should indirectly endorse them. So think about lobbying to obtain a privilege to restrict sort of competition in my area. This is clearly a profitable business opportunity, clearly something detrimental to the industry and to the country at large. Should I, as a teacher, be neutral, criticize it, or be positive? And what I claim is most people are not necessarily positive, but they take an hypocritical, neutral standing. Following Sartre, I think that people are condemned to choose. You cannot not choosing, because not choosing is choosing not to choose. And it's not just playing with words. There is a big, big meaning underlying this, is that sometimes when we claim we are social scientists and we forget the social and we emphasize the scientists, we say that we only have to describe the world and not give any positive normative indication. But the lack of doing that has dramatic consequences. And let me make an example. A very famous and esteemed colleague of mine, Gary Becker, many years ago in 1968, started this branch that is called economics of crime. And to make things simple, but that's the essence, is basically comparing cost and benefits of committing a crime. So what is the benefit? Is the fact that you steal some money, let's say. What is the cost? Is certain probability you're caught, and if you're caught, you have to pay a penalty, and that's the amount of the penalty. So you compare the two. And this is it's not a perfect theory, it's a pretty useful theory, especially when you think about white-collar crime. If you are thinking about killing your spouse, this is not sort of a good model to sort of think about this decision, because generally you do it in an impetus of irrationality, you're not sort of calculating. But if you are a CEO that think about sort of altering the accounts and stuff like that, this is not a crazy model to do it. However, many faculty, not Gary Becker himself, many faculty teach this model as saying it's rational to commit a crime every time the expected benefit is bigger than the expected cost, which implicitly is saying it's irrational not to commit a crime when the expected benefits is bigger than the expected cost. Now, you cannot tell me that this is a value-neutral proposition. If I tell you it's irrational not to commit a crime, irrationality is generally equated with stupidity. It's not necessarily, but it's generally equated. It's not a good thing. And the result is that people become more amoral than they used to be before. And there is plenty of evidence that not only economists are, before they become economists, more amoral than the average, but they become even more amoral after they've taken economic classes. So I think that not only we don't help, we hurt. And precisely because I'm not a big fan of government regulation, I think there is a real need of sort of social norms that are designed to make capitalism better. Because I think that capitalism is a fantastic system, has brought wealth throughout the world in an unprecedented way, but it has some elements of distortion, and these elements need to be attenuated or fixed if we want the system to survive long term. So now the last question is, who has an interest in creating those norms? And the answer is very simple. The institution with the best interest of creating those norms are business schools. Because business schools thrive out of not only a form of capitalism, thrive of a meritocratic, competitive form of capitalism. If you grow up in a country in which the CEO job is allocated on base of where you're born or who you marry with, you don't go to business school. Okay? You do only go to business school if you think that the system is meritocratic and your human capital is appreciated and used. So our business model relies on capitalism working in its best form. So we have a vested interest to have capitalism work in the best form, and so we have a responsibility to try to create those norms and enforce those norms. And again, I'm not talking about deep moral norms. I talk about minimum level of sort of good business etiquettes that very often we tend to forget. And I think not only we have sort of a possibility, we have a moral responsibility to do it, because the US form of capitalism has been the goose from the golden egg that has made all of us better off, and we need to work hard to preserve it, because if we don't work, who will? Thank you. So there is room for a few questions, so feel free to ask them. Please.
Talking about cost and benefit in economy. gave the expected cost and expected benefit. What do you think of opportunity and risk as mitigating factors? So in this case, you talk about quantitative measure as well as non-quantitative measure.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Because
in your example, you said cost and benefit as input output to make a decision. When you gave that crime example.
Sure.
So I'm saying, what about considering cost, opportunity, and risk?
No.
As mitigating factors, those are not quantitative, and you might change your decision.
Actually, I wanted to be simple in the analysis, an expected utility analysis. So risk is factor in that analysis. So I describe it to you in a risk-neutral way. You can put risk aversion, and so you'll be a little bit less likely to commit a crime. But the most important point I wanted to bring is that normal human beings call what we call irrational, call moral behavior. And while that behavior is not enough to prevent the most extreme sort of outcome, I think it is a very useful fabric to well-working society. So I have done a lot of work on trust, how much people trust each other without knowing each other. And I'm fascinated by the fact, first of all, how different this is across countries. Just to give you a sense, 55% of Norwegian and Finns trust each other, 4% of Brazilians trust each other. So that's kind of the spectrum. And it's much more difficult to have a good working market economy if you are always concerned about somebody else taking all the opportunities to cheat you. Because the opportunities to cheat you are infinite. And now, if you are negotiating a multi-million-dollar contract, of course you're going to have lawyers that look at that, and you cannot rely on these social norms. But when you buy your newspaper at the corner, when you do the daily transaction, having a bit of that trust makes a lot of difference in the quality of the working. And that's what I'm trying to sort of recreate.
Good evening.
Okay.
Thank you so much, first of all, for a great talk. I think it's a bit ironic how it's in the business school in AUB, which is, as you can see, the most capitalistic kind of part of AUB. I think you have asked the right questions, but you did not take the conclusions to the end to reach the correct ones. Slavoj Žižek, an Eastern European philosopher, has an interesting book in which he makes a similar analysis to what you do. It's called Living the End Times, in which he evokes how 30, 40 years ago, maybe most of us here are not old enough to remember, but people used to dream of socialism with a human face. Now as if what we're trying to do is the same, we're dreaming of capitalism with a human face. Capitalism without corruption, with a bit more welfare to the poor. But what if these problems of capitalism are inherent to itself? What if the system is approaching inevitably a certain end? Here, of course, I'm not kind of, I'm not advocating the return to the old Leninist party. I feel that 20th century communism was a mega catastrophe in all aspects. But I think it is just, to conclude, I think it's utopian to think that things will indefinitely go the way they are. They are bound to change.
No, it's definitely true that they're about to change, but I hope I'm exactly not a utopian. It says I'm open to the possibility that somebody will find a day a better system. I don't think that capitalism is the end of the world, and we have seen historically that things have changed. So I'm open intellectually to that possibility. Unfortunately, I've not seen it so far. And precisely because I'm not utopian, I'm a bit nervous of somebody who will come up with a system that requires to make major changes. Because with all its defects, capitalism has delivered a lot. And I actually like what you said, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. In the capitalist world, it's never trying to say we want a capitalist with a better face. The free marketeers always say, this is the system, if you don't like it, screw you. And in that sense, they have not been critical enough of the aspect that I consider marginal, but if they accumulate over time can lead to a much sort of worse world, that affect the capitalist system. So I want to sort of raise a criticism of capitalism from within, not from the outside. And, you know, of course, if you are socialists or people who are sort of different views, they can do criticism on the outside. And I respect them. I just sort of don't agree with the conclusion. I'm open to see a new system in the future. But as I said, at the moment, I don't see it. But what I do see is a system that works well, but is degenerating and going to the wrong direction. Yep.
I'm just wondering how you see the role of the media, specifically the corporate media in all of this. It seems to me that in addition to the perverse effect of lobbying, the perverse ownership of the media has a huge impact on democracy and a very hurtful impact on the success of capitalism. So if you could balance that with what's happening with WikiLeaks, for example, and how you see all that playing out, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The ownership of the media is absolutely crucial for the system to work, and in particular, in my framework, is doubly important. So that's the reason why I think that antitrust of the media should be extremely strongly enforced. In this respect, I'm not a big fan of the professional comedian who won 25% of the vote, but just to tell you that the guy is not fool at all, one of his proposals is to say, we want to put a cap on the market share of advertising of each provider in Italy, which I think is the smartest way to do this antitrust, because who controls advertising controls information. And so you don't want anybody to have too much of it. Now, he's putting the threshold at 5%, which seems a bit too tough. But you know, you start at 5 and maybe you compromise at 10. But I think as a logic is absolutely the right logic. Now, I think that I'm very optimistic about the role that the new media have, and in particular, places like Wikipedia are really changing, I think, the way information is transmitted, etc. And why? Because old media had this big disadvantage that they were starting from a point to many points. Is the center irradiating to the periphery. So they were particularly useful for dictatorship or people who want to control, because if you control the center, you can control the information. Once you have a significant cost of printing a book, it's easier to influence the printing press, and that influence the information around. With Wikipedia or the internet in general, you have a peer-to-peer kind of communication. So it's much more difficult to influence from the top. And if you want later, I don't want to take it, but I was involved in a particular situation in Italy in which actually the investigation by Wikipedia brought to surface something important for the political debate that nobody had seen. And you know, there were a lot of Italian journalists that had this information below their eyes and they couldn't see it. And when I look at Wikipedia, I saw that there is a sort of documentation of the debate. So you see the fight between two sides that were saying, oh, this information is not checked. No, I check in this way. No, and again, it's fascinating because you ask yourself the question is why these people are doing that. They don't get rich. They don't get famous. Is in the spirit of what I advocate in my book is if you can leverage the small amount of participation, most people care strongly about a few things and are willing to donate their time for these ideas, for things to come through. And Wikipedia is a fantastic way to aggregate this, but also in a way that tries to select out the misinformation. And so I think that I'm not an expert in social network, and I'm not an expert in the way you can filter this stuff and etc. So I'm sure that there will be ways in which people will try to prevent. But I think that if we compare this world to the world in which you have one channel on national TV, this is definitely a better world. Yeah.
You've said throughout your presentation that government subsidy to businesses is not the right way to do it because it makes businessmen lose competition in the global market. While we still see this kind of practice in most of third world countries and even in Europe and even the United States upon the global financial crisis. So sluggish economy or low growth economy, what would you think the alternative would be if there's no government subsidy to businesses?
I think that as a temporary measure, the reduction in taxation is the most effective way. If you want to incentivize people to sort of get going, you lower taxes. The other thing is there are so many margins which you can work by cutting government regulation that makes it difficult to enter. There is a fantastic research on how many days it takes for a business to get started. In Canada, 2 days. In Colombia, 250. Why? That's a way to keep business illegal in Colombia. In that way, you can sort of keep it at bay and all this. So if you bring in Colombia the number of days from 250 to 2, that's much more powerful than any potential subsidy. The big difference is that that is a general benefit, so that you don't have a big sort of industrialist lobbying for that particular benefit. Okay? It should be the population at large. And as sort of a friend of mine who spent some time in Washington said, in Washington you learn that the truth is just one of the many lobbies and not a particularly well-funded one.
With the global competition today, do you really think it's feasible for one of the countries to emerge as a leader towards this movement that you're recommending? Like with the competition between emerging and developed markets on the rise, do you really think that one country has the capacity to fight corporate capitalism and put itself in a worse view towards corporates today?
I think that it's an excellent question, and my answer is I'm not sure. It says I hope, but I'm not sure. I think that you're touching a very delicate point, which is very often, especially in smaller countries, regulation in favor of business is seen as promoting national champions. And France is the champion in this business, but I think a lot of countries play this game, and they don't understand how dangerous that is. I think that, at least from a US perspective, fortunately, they're still large enough that this is not a major consideration. And my major concern is that they might retrench. In the sense, one of the characteristics that we had in the post-World War II period is that the most efficient firms were in the United States, and the most powerful army was in the United States. And so, surprise, surprise, free markets got spread out because the most efficient firms want free markets, because the freer the markets, the more you win. And you had the guns to do it. And now, they weren't literally using the guns, but Theodore Roosevelt was saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. And sort of, the US definitely carried a big stick. Now, unfortunately, we're in a situation in which the United States firms are not necessarily the most efficient worldwide, but their army is still the most effective one worldwide. And so my big fear is that the United States will start moving protectionist and anti-free market, and it will be very difficult for the rest of the world to fight back. And it's not a surprise that you've seen in the last WTO, etc., Brazil and China taking some position that were more pro-free market than the United States. I fear that this is just the beginning of a dangerous path.
I just wanted to ask you about your take on what just happened recently over the weekend in Cyprus, passing the law taxing the deficits. Don't you think that's not only a step in the wrong direction, but like a leap in the opposite direction you want the system to go in?
Actually, you'll be surprised, not necessarily. Let me tell you my views. First of all, I think that is immoral, indecent, and bad from an economic point of view to bail out all the banks all the time with taxpayers' money. And that's the reason why in the book I have a sort of a reader-friendly version of a proposal that I elaborate in academic sort of journal with a colleague from Harvard that tries to deal with that problem in a systematic way. And I don't want to bother you, but you can refer to that. But this said, in general, what you want is at least to have some... And I think is a serious risk. That's the reason why I would have made it clear why I've done this and not done it below a certain level. So I would have said, look, my policy is I take bail-in from creditors. De facto, large deposit from Russian creditors. That's the reason why I do it here for this. In the future, I will never impose any haircut for deposits below X. Deposit above X, it's a fair game. And I think that the problem with the European authorities is they don't have a consistent pattern, which they're not unique because the United States did worse. During the financial crisis was a Russian roulette. Depending on what side of the game you were, and if the Treasury Secretary liked you or not, you ended up bail out completely or in default. And this is not capitalism. This is sort of old Italian or Russian mafia. So I don't like that. And I think that, so the conclusion is they've done a step in the right direction. They might have done also a step in the wrong direction. Something in between would have been perfect.
Thank you. There is a reception outside, but I just want to point out that the daughter, Luigi's daughter, who lost in the Monopoly, is with us, who's very proud of her dad, Gloria. Why don't you stand up? Give her a applause. Thank you. There is a reception outside. Please join us.
Yeah,